All right, so as we start talking more specifically about how we activate reproductive function in livestock species, it's important to remember one thing that we discussed in the very beginning of class, and that is that the reproductive system is governed by the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So in this figure here, we've got the hypothalamus, the pituitary, which is a lobed system. It looks similar to a scrotum, I know. And then we have the gonad. And so in the female, it of course is the ovary. In the male, it's going to be the testes. So this figure here is an example of the female hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So when it comes to reproduction, both in the male and the female, GnRH is king. And so the hormone gonadotropin releasing hormone, abbreviated as GnRH, is one that you need to commit to memory. And so this hormone is actually synthesized in the cell body of a GnRH neuron, which is located here in the hypothalamus. And so the cell body is going to be where that GnRH hormone is actually produced, so inside the cell here. And the axon, which is the longer portion of the neuron, is going to carry the transmitter or carry the hormone to the dendrite. And so this long part of the neuron here is the transportation system. And the dendrite at the end of this neuron is the part of the structure that will actually secrete or dump the hormone into another system. And so in the case of GnRH, it is the GnRH neuron occurs and is placed in the hypothalamus, and the GnRH hormone will be secreted as a neurotransmitter into the bloodstream and be shuttled to the anterior pituitary. And so these dendrites are really important because they are actually the secretion mechanism. That part of the cell actually has mechanics in place to let that hormone into the system. And so that happens when the cell body is actually stimulated. And so if we look at the figures here, even though they're in black and white, you can still get the general idea. This part up here is the hypothalamus. We have different lobes of the hypothalamus, and I'll show you a picture of a live hypothalamus here in just a few minutes. But these are the different areas that we know certain neurons are isolated to. And so GnRH is just one type of several neurons, several types of neurons that are in the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus will then result in right directly underneath it the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is made up of the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And just keep in mind that those two lobes are from different origins. So the anterior pituitary actually develops from the roof of the mouth, and the posterior pituitary develops from the hypothalamus, and they join together during the embryogenesis process. And so over here, this figure, we actually have a micrograph of a hypothalamus tissue. And you can see here that we've got a lot of different things going on. So we've got different parts of the hypothalamus that are shown here. And this is under a really, really intense microscope. And so the paraventricular nucleus is where we see a lot of GnRH dendrites actually ending in. And so it's a highly, highly, highly intricate system in this capillary bed portion of the top of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And so it's really quite interesting how these two things are connected together. And so down here towards the bottom, this is going to be a lot of capillary system that is going to produce, or that is going to house certain cell types that are going to produce things like LH and FSH. All right, so just to give you a little bit of background about GnRH, because I like to kind of give you guys or help relate this stuff. This is a literature review endeavor that I undertook in graduate school, and I was primarily working on puberty in heifers, and specifically looking at the different proteins that were secreted that affected when an animal came into puberty. And so one of those questions was, well, when does the GnRH neuron actually get activated? Because as you'll learn in chapter 6, the activation of the GnRH neuron is directly related to when a female will come into puberty. And so I spent about 3 months on this for many hours a day, reading literature, trying to figure out everything that affected a GnRH neuron. And so the GnRH neuron is kind of represented within the black borders here. Everything on the side is hormones or proteins that actually affect or have the GnRH neuron as a target tissue. So they're binding somewhere to this neuron. And so we've got a bunch on that side and a bunch on this side over here. And then the part that I was really interested in was everything that was going on inside the neuron. So I showed you that cell body here, and this is what I'm talking about. So all of this stuff is going on in this cell body. And so you can see that we've got a lot of different proteins being produced. We've got things like dopamine and serotonin being produced in this neuron. We've got several things that are working as a system inside this neuron. And one that is really, really interesting that we'll talk a little bit more about in chapter 6 with puberty is the kisspeptin system. And so I don't expect you guys to know this. I just thought that it's interesting, and I want to show you how complex this neuron is. So it really responds to a lot of different things. And I'm getting really excited just talking about this stuff again. I love this stuff. And so with GnRH signaling, these, after GnRH is produced, because of a lot of this stuff here, we're going to get secretion of GnRH in the dendrite area. And then GnRH is then going to travel in the female to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and in the male. And then it's going to bind to its receptor. And its receptor is a serpentine receptor that actually sets kind of here on the edge of the cell body. So this blue area here is the cell body, or the cell wall, and this serpentine receptor sets kind of in that cell wall. GnRH attaches to it, and it changes this whole conformation here. And when this conformation changes, it kicks off a mess of crap inside the anterior pituitary cells. And so this is going to be like a gonadotrope cell that's going to produce FSH and LH. And so there's a lot of these really intricate pieces of protein that are upregulated and downregulated depending on what binds to its receptor here. And so we're going to talk more specifically about signaling in our reproductive hormones towards the end of this chapter. Right, so as we look at the neuron function, I linked this YouTube video, which is a Khan Academy video, into Blackboard. And so you'll be able to watch that on your own. It's about 7 minutes long. It's a great explanation of neuron function. And so the figure that we see here, this is actually some histology slides of slices of a hypothalamus. And so when you do histology, you can take really, really, really extremely thin slices of the hypothalamic tissue out of an animal that was in a certain state. And then you can actually stain the tissue for a specific neuron that you're wanting to investigate. And so these tissues were stained for the GnRH neuron. And you can kind of sort of see here in A, and we can see it blown up here, that we have a really big part of the cell body, which is darker in color and bigger in size. But then we have all of these axons that run for a really, really long ways. And so we've been able to track as scientists GnRH neurons that have axons clear up here, and then have dendrites clear down here around the third ventricle. And so this ventricle area is really important because it's actually the center part of the hypothalamus. And so all the hormones will get dumped into the third ventricle and will travel into the hypophyseal portal system, which will be taken to the anterior pituitary gland. And so you can just see how clearly they are highlighted here. And then the third ventricle system is blown up in this area, and the more concentrated and the darker the color, the greater the concentration of neurons are.